So, hey friends, welcome back to the channel. So, you might have seen news like governments upload billions of dollars while they're still in debt. So, what does this mean, and why does every country on this world is in debt? Take an example. Let's say US, it is in 35, $36 trillion in debt, and it's the wealthiest nation in the world. Or take Japan, for example, which has debt as much as twice its GDP. So in this video, let's discuss why are countries in debt and why don't they just print money to get out of their debt? And is a country's debt bad? From whom do the countries borrow? And in the end, as a conclusion, we'll discuss, can a country be debt free? Before discussing all these points, let's first discuss what the country's debt is. It is also called as the national debt. Now, this is the total money that the central government owes. And the central government can borrow money from different sources. For example, other countries or big financial institutions like the IMF or the World Bank or its own citizens. Also, one thing to note is that this debt does not include the local or state debt, and it does not include citizens' personal debt like personal loans, mortgages, education loan, all these things. So this is the only money that the central government owes to different sources. Now, when we have a good understanding of what a national debt is, let's discuss why do country borrows money on the first place, and why don't they just print unlimited money? So if they keep printing money, they would think that they have unlimited of it, and this would result in reckless spending, which will flood the economy with cash. And this is actually not a good thing. This will result in hyperinflation and the prices of everything will skyrocket and economy in turn would crash. And this has already happened with countries like Zimbabwe, Venezuela. Also, foreign investors will lose trust on this devalued currency and would take out their investments out of the country and would invest in other safe countries. So this is not good for economy. So this is why the concept of borrowing came into place, because this would force countries to manage money more responsibly, because they would be paying interest on that loan. So it gives them a sense of responsibility. But the question still is, why do they borrow on the first place? Now, there can be several reasons for that. And first is to cover the budget deficit. So the primary source of income for the central government are the taxes. Now let's say the income of the country was $3 trillion and the expenses were 4 trillion. So they have in the end of the year a $1 trillion deficit. Now they could cover this deficit by two ways. First is cutting down the services, be it healthcare, education, and other basic services. And this would be really bad for the economy and the residents and would result in protests. And the other way, that it is to increase the taxes. And higher the taxes, it is going to have the same consequence. The protest will start again, people will be unhappy. So that's why what they do is take the loan for $1 trillion, and they would pay interest on that year on year. The second is to invest in the growth of the country. Borrowing isn't always a bad thing. If we consider an example of a small nation who doesn't have that much resources or money to build the basic infra, and if the country waits for extended period of time, maybe several years, to accumulate that kind of wealth to build the basic infra, residents would suffer a lot in this time. So what the government would do or should do is to borrow money to build this basic infra first. Now, how is it good for the country? It is because it is going to improve the economy. People are going to be more healthy and more literate, and they could contribute to the economy boom. Hence, the government could increase taxes in the long term, and it would be easier for the government to repay the debt. The third point is handling crises and emergencies. So, this could include any kind of war or any kind of pandemic like COVID. So, if we take example of the pandemic that happened recently, that was COVID-19, the economy was going down for almost all the countries because industries were shutting down. There was not enough trade happening among the countries inside the country. So it was the best for them to borrow money to stabilize the economy and to come up with different kind of solutions to get out of this pandemic. Same thing is with the war. Fourth is to pay the existing debt. Now let's say our country had taken a loan in 2010 for 10 years and it was worth, let's say, $10 billion. And in 2020 the deadline has come, but the government don't have enough resources to repay that debt. So what they do is it takes another loan which has another new deadline, for example 2030. So now, using the new loan, the government has paid the existing loan, but the interest on the new loan will continue. And this is how the cycle goes. Now, this is only good if this cycle is in control and the government is managing that responsibly. But if it does go out of control, well, this has happened with Sri Lanka in 2022 when it defaulted on $51 billion. And there are other ways to counter this kind of debt, which we'll discuss later in the video. So, fifth is to control interest rates and inflation. So, this is a kind of cycle, and government do this mostly by issuing bonds. Now, this can affect the economy in three ways. First is it control inflation. Second, stabilize the currency. And third, it influences the interest rates. So, for example, in a country, inflation is rising up at a rapid pace. So, to counter this, what government do is it issues bond to pull money out of the economy, which in turn lets the inflation go down. And on the other hand, when the economy is too slow, what government do is borrow a lot of money from other investors to inject it into the economy and stimulate growth. Now, let's understand who lends money to countries. So, there are basically three main players in that. The first is the domestic lenders, second, the foreign lenders, and third is the central banks. So, let's cover all of these things one by one. Domestic lenders and government borrows money from the domestic people in terms of bonds, and these can be local citizens, banks, companies, etc. So what these organizations do, like local citizens, banks, companies, they buy the bonds and lend the money to the government. Second are the foreign lenders. Now again, there are bonds that these foreign entities can buy, and if not bonds, they can directly give loans to the country. So for example, organizations like World Bank or the or for countries in Asia, there is Asian Development Bank. So these are the institutions that provide direct loan for longer term for infra development, that can be roads, schools, health, education, energy projects. And they do have lower interest rates, but they do have strict conditions as well. And the third is to borrow money from the central banks. So, in theory, governments can borrow money from their own central banks. So, for example, central government can borrow money from RBI in India, which is the Reserve Bank of India, and this is called as the debt monetization. And what happens in this is central banks prints new money and then buy the government bonds, which is the other way of saying lending money to the government. So this is a kind of cycle. So central banks print money, buy bonds, give debt to the government, and government has to pay interest on that. So most countries don't do this anymore because it can cause currency devaluation and hyperinflation, as we had discussed. So instead, what central banks do is they buy the government bonds, but indirectly. So what they do is they mostly buy these bonds from the commercial banks who had bought them first. But this is mostly done to control the interest rates and inflation rather than just lending money to the government. Now, one question to ponder here is what if a country is is in chaos or broke and can't find new debt? So, for example, Sri Lanka, it defaulted in 2022. So, in this case, IMF comes into picture. IMF is the International Monetary Fund, which provides emergency loans to prevent countries collapse. IMF provides loans at a very low interest rates, but it comes with super strict restrictions. And these can include tax increase, spending cuts, and privatizing state-owned companies. So because of these super strict restrictions, you can see a lot of protest and chaos in the country in which all these restrictions are applied. So now the question is that bad for the countries? Now it has two aspects to it. So first is it can be good. So if the country borrows money to build infrastructure, public services, which in turn could help them boost their economy, or the country is going through some kind of emergency, be it a war or pandemic. So the thing to note here is as long as the debt is manageable, it is good. It is good for the country and the economy. But one thing to keep in mind is taking too much debt is dangerous. So when the countries keep borrowing money, they come into a sort of this debt trap in which they are spending more money on interest than on the public services. And this is where the things can go nasty. Also, the countries also have credit ratings, and when this debt crisis happens in a country, the foreign investors don't lend money or they demand high interest or because of the fear of default. And this is what happened to Sri Lanka in 2022. So the only thing is to keep in mind to take that much debt that is manageable. But how much debt is too much? So according to the economist, there is debt to GDP ratio, which is how much do the country owe and what is the GDP of that country. And if it is 60% or less, it is a good sign. But if you talk about countries like US, it has a debt ceiling, and if the government hit that ceiling, government cannot borrow more. But that does not happen in the real life because US governments keep changing the debt ceiling again and again so that it doesn't happen to them that they cannot borrow more. Now, in the end, let's discuss, can countries be debt free? Well, technically, yes, they can be. But in reality, almost no country is completely debt free. And I think it's not a good idea as well because to be completely debt free, they have to do massive spending cuts. And these are going to cut down spending on basic infra and services, or they are going to have very high taxes, both of which will slow down the economic growth. Also, when countries are borrowing money, they give bonds to domestic investors or the foreign investors, which is generally categorized as the safe investments because country themselves are never going to default on their own. So if countries are going to completely debt free, we are going to lose that risk-free investments. So this is what I wanted to discuss about the country's debt and how it's going to affect the economy and us. So that's it for today's video. See you in the next one.